Good evening from Rocky Mountain PBS. I'm Cynthia Hessen. This is Colorado State of Mind. In recent weeks, Boulder extended its challenge to state regulation of hydraulic fracking, by passing a one-year moratorium on fracking within city limits or on city-owned open space. Governor John Hickenlooper is on record saying the state could sue cities that ban fracking. And last week, President Obama upset some environmental groups when he praised new drilling for natural gas and the fracking that is required to mine it. In a few minutes, we'll talk with Tisha Schuller, president of the Colorado Oil and Gas Association, the industry group, and with Boulder City Councilwoman Suzanne Jones. But first, we have reporter Steve Mort, who has been reporting on this for a while. What is the economic impact of oil and gas exploration in Colorado?
Well, Cynthia, you know, oil and gas exploration in Colorado is a $31 billion a year industry. And in 2012, fracking led to a 55-year high in oil production in the state. And the industry says fracking contributes around $1 billion in public revenue a year. In Colorado and throughout the United States, oil and natural gas are big business. It's not hard to spot natural gas drilling rigs and wells throughout the West. In the U.S., there are more than 500,000 natural gas wells. The majority utilize a process known as hydraulic fracturing, where a mix of chemicals and water is pumped hundreds of feet underground to fracture the rock, allowing natural gas trapped in the shale to flow to the surface. But despite new federal guidelines on fracking published this year, dozens of municipalities around the country are taking their own action on fracking. Among them, Boulder. Last month, the county extended a moratorium on oil and gas drilling by 18 months in unincorporated areas, and the city council passed a one-year moratorium. In the east of the county, residents of Longmont last year voted to impose a ban on fracking in their city by a 60 to 40% margin. Speaking after the November vote, anti-fracking activist Michael Belmont welcomed the ban.
It's an extreme health risk, especially in a densely populated area like this, and clearly the citizens agreed with an overwhelming support across all partisan lines, across all political persuasions, that this should not be permitted in the city limits.
Governor John Hickenlooper opposes moves to ban fracking within municipalities, saying it unfairly removes drilling companies' mineral rights. The state and the Colorado Oil and Gas Association have sued Longmont to get its ban overturned. Immediately after the decision by Longmont voters, one scientist told me the risks posed by fracking are minimal.
It's not a new process. Since 1947, over 1 million wells have been fracture stimulated in the United States with, frankly, very little regulation compared to what we see now. And if there was an environmental problem with it, you would be seeing that similar to some of the other environmental problems that have occurred with strip mining, etc. It is just a very safe process.
Elsewhere in Colorado, a heated debate is underway in Loveland, with activists there calling for a 2-year moratorium on fracking. Meanwhile, Colorado Springs last year agreed on rules governing oil and gas exploration. And in May this year, Fort Collins councillors voted to lift the moratorium on fracking.
So a lot of activity around the state where municipalities have had to consider what activists against fracking are saying. Also, I think of the governor, John Hickenlooper, drinking fracking fluid. That's how he points out that he thinks it's perfectly safe.
Yeah, that's right. Well, the governor says he's trying to be neutral on this issue, but he is on record as supporting many of the positions of the oil and gas industry in the state. One of the key complaints from people who are opposed to fracking is this cocktail of chemicals and water and sand that's pumped underground, and then, you know, what that's used for is to, first of all, to frack the rock and then to prop the rock open to prevent it from naturally healing itself so that the oil or gas, whatever is being fracked for, can come to the surface. And much of the concern lies in what is exactly in that cocktail, what chemicals are there, and what impact could that possibly have on drinking water. The science is sort of inconclusive here. Some scientists say there's very clear evidence that, in fact, we have seen pollution as a result of the fracking practices that have taken place in different parts of the state and the country, whereas other scientists say there really isn't any indication that this is a danger to the public and that this is all sort of really hearsay. The governor has said that he does believe that the industry is being responsible in the way that it puts the chemicals into the ground and stores it when it comes to the surface again. And as you mentioned, drinking the hydraulic fracturing fluid itself, not sure whether many people would recommend that, but as a way of illustrating that this is something that is safe. So he's kind of treading a tightrope. He's come out against these municipalities that have themselves put into place moratoria in the past. He said that basically it's not a good idea to have a patchwork of different regulations across Colorado, that this is something that should be done on the state and the federal level.
All right, so it's what's in that cocktail that matters, but the industry considers that proprietary.
Well, this is interesting, and of course federal regulations govern exactly what has to be disclosed and what doesn't. Now, there is a website called frackfocus.org, and that is where companies can voluntarily post up the chemicals that they use, the cocktail that they use on that website, so people can go and see a certain degree of transparency there, except chemicals that they do deem proprietary. A lot of these companies are competitors. They don't want to let the opposition know exactly the methods that they're using in the fracturing process. What the federal guidelines also do is put into place a way to verify whether or not the wells are being drilled safely, and also what happens to that wastewater when it comes back to the surface. We're talking billions of gallons used in the hydraulic fracturing process. That's, of course, another whole issue here in the West where we're very short of water. But the way that is stored to prevent seepage back to the water table. It might be the case, according to some environmentalists, that the water doesn't leak out during the process of fracturing just because it takes place many thousands of feet under the ground below the water table. It may happen in seepage from these big sort of trenches that are dug to store the wastewater. And that's another area that the industry has to verify it's putting into place best practices, and that's all part of the federal regulations that are in place.
Thanks, Steve, very much for getting us set up on the topic at the moment. And when we come back, two women who have been in the eye of the storm over fracking. With me now, Tisha Schuller, president of the Colorado Oil and Gas Association, and Suzanne Jones, member of the Boulder City Council and a former regional director of the Wilderness Society. Welcome to both of you. And Suzanne, now with what the city of Boulder has done with this one-year moratorium, what's the immediate practical effect? Are wells shut down?
We just passed in June a one-year moratorium on accepting any new permits to drill, both within the city limits as well as on our open space, which is outside the city limits in the county. And we do not have any active permits pending, so there is no practical stoppage of drilling per se, but it does protect us going into the future. At that time, the county had not extended their moratorium, so our open space lands were vulnerable. And these are lands that we've invested millions of dollars of the taxpayer funds on to protect for recreation values, for watershed values, for wildlife. And so as good stewards, we thought it was very important to make sure those lands are protected pending public health impact studies that are underway. And also there's litigation pending, including Kogo's lawsuit against Longmont, that will have ramifications for local authority over these matters.
Tisha, you and Suzanne are actually friends. You've been on either side of this issue for a long while, but when you're dealing with a city council in Boulder or in Longmont or anywhere else where they're looking at something like this, where they want to put the brakes on it, what's your standard answer?
The first thing to know is over the last year, 26 cities and counties across Colorado have had this conversation and either looked to put a ban or a moratorium or rules more stringent than the state. So of the 26, 23 of them have been resolved, with 3 remaining in Boulder County. And so this is a well-worn path for us from the last year. The first thing to know is that we really have to understand and respect the concerns brought forward by individuals, by families, and by the community. If you're not familiar with oil and gas development, this is a really serious and scary change. And so we take that very seriously. The second is to make sure that people know what is actually in place in terms of state regulations, and that there is a very important role for those cities and counties. And then lastly, we work to customize a solution. So in all the cases of the other 23, either some kind of memorandum of understanding was put in place with the operators or the state, regulations were passed that were appropriate with state primacy, or they decided ultimately that they were comfortable working within the state process. So this is something that has happened and will continue to happen, but it's something that we as Coloradans can navigate through and have been for decades.
The major concern is what this could do to the water table, isn't that right?
Well, there's a lot of concerns, both known impacts and concerns about unknown risks. So there is concern about water pollution and the potential for both surface and underground water pollution. One of the other major impacts that people are very worried about is toxic air pollution. And we know that that is a regular byproduct of oil and gas development, both things like benzene, which is a known carcinogen, things like volatile organic compounds, they call them, which is basically a precursor to ozone or smog that precipitates asthma in kids and is bad for elders. And then things like methane, which is an incredibly powerful greenhouse gas emission. So that's a major concern. And then there's the community impacts. I mean, you have trucks, major trucks coming into your area, which call noise and dust. You have a whole infrastructure of pads and wells and pipelines. You have, in many cases, declining property values because people don't want to live next to this stuff. I mean, living next to a drill rig is noisy, it's dirty, it's smelly. I don't want to live there. I'm assuming you don't want to live there. People don't want to live next to this stuff. We have people, if you've been to a public hearing, you have people coming who have had their homes surrounded by fracking who are complaining about kids with nosebleeds and headaches and real impacts. And some of the preliminary studies done, and I'm guessing we would both agree that a lot more study needs to be done on the public health impacts of fracking, but some of the preliminary studies have shown some very real and alarming concerns that need to be addressed.
Is that true that you would agree that more public health study needs to be done?
Suzanne and I would agree on more things than we disagree on. For example, concerns about ensuring that groundwater is protected, that air emissions are controlled, that methane, a greenhouse gas precursor, a powerful greenhouse gas, and other greenhouse gas emissions are controlled. Those are all things that we would agree on. The different perspective that I would bring is that oil and gas development has been happening in Colorado for 100 years, and there are also communities that are living and thriving with oil and gas development. So it's not a simply negative proposition. I absolutely agree that it's an industrial process that has very real impacts on a community that must be managed and addressed. But I don't think it's a throw the baby out with the bathwater scenario. We all use oil and gas. Our society is completely interdependent, and it's incumbent upon all of us to take responsibility for our oil and gas use and navigate this very difficult approach in a way that's respectful of concerns, but also acknowledging that we use this. We need to be a part of figuring out how to produce it well.
Tisha, one thing that you hear about all the time is people wondering what's in this cocktail that is injected into the rock to get to the gas or the oil. Is the industry willing to be completely transparent about what they're using?
So Colorado has mandatory hydraulic fracturing disclosure, so most of the mystery is now out for the public. Any of your viewers can go to fracfocus.org. Since April 1st, Colorado was one of the first states to mandate this comprehensive disclosure. Now, the biggest critique you'll hear of that is there's still trade secret protection. In Colorado, when you protect a trade secret, you still have to put what kind of chemical it is and what quantity it's in, so that if you're concerned about the potential for what's in this or what are the health impacts, that there is a way that you can know some basics about it. All of that, for the most part, in Colorado has taken hydraulic fracturing disclosure off the table. People are interested to a point, and then they're really the day-to-day engagement about traffic, dust, noise, the things that Suzanne was mentioning. That's ultimately where people end up being the most interested in spending time with us engaging.
I guess the one thing I might add, though, about disclosure is there was just a report that was done by Harvard that came out and said, you know what, this frac focus database, it doesn't work well enough yet to be considered a substitute for mandatory reporting. It's not very searchable. The allowance for trade secret means that a whole lot of stuff isn't being reported such that the public can take a look at it and understand what's happening. And so there was that one isn't figured out yet. I would agree, however, that knowing how you're being poisoned, if you will, is not as important as actually trying to do something about it. And I was really happy to hear you say, Tisha, that the industry is very concerned about methane emissions. One of the things that we're finding out is it's often said that natural gas is clean burning or cleaner burning than coal. And that means at the end, when you get to the power plant, fewer emissions. There's still plenty of emissions, but there's less than coal. But what we're finding out is that there's actually a lot of methane leakage that happens in the pipelines, in the storage tanks, and in the drilling operations for natural gas that calls into question if it really is cleaner than coal. And these are all leaks or flaring. Sometimes they're on purpose because of pressure buildup or whatever, and they've got a vent or flare. These are all things that are solvable by technology today, and yet those technologies aren't being used.
So I'm so glad you brought up methane emissions because this is a passion of mine. It's one of the reasons I got into this business. But before we do that, I will just say the Harvard study, very important study, identified some very clear issues. It did not evaluate Colorado has a new version of Frac Focus going into place, so it doesn't address that. So
hopefully that will fix things.
Right. Hopefully there will be a lot of improvements, and we're looking forward. That's going to be an ongoing dialogue. With regard to methane emissions, we're fortunate in Colorado to live in a state that is orders of magnitude ahead of the rest of the country. So I had the good fortune of testifying in front of a Senate subcommittee on EPA's new rules aimed at addressing greenhouse gas emissions from the oil and gas industry in favor of their new rules. So this is a unique position to be in as an oil and gas representative because Colorado has done a lot of work ahead of other states because we have a non-attainment area for ozone precursors. The work that we do to address those addresses greenhouse gas emissions. So what you'll see among oil and gas operators in Colorado is that we're aware of the issue, we're keenly interested, and we're at least 3 to 4 years ahead of the rest of the country in addressing these things. So we've really embraced EPA's new regulations, and I think that as ongoing studies continue to show how the oil and gas industry has addressed emissions, we don't have good studies of most recent emissions. I think we're going to continue to find that Colorado will be an oil and gas leader around greenhouse gas emissions, and that's where we want to be.
I agree. That's where we want to be. And one of the things that I'd like to ask you is Governor Hickenlooper, who is known pretty widely as a champion of the oil and gas industry, and some might argue to the detriment of communities, which is an issue that comes up a lot on the local government level. But even he has called for zero tolerance of methane emissions. And there is an upcoming rulemaking in Colorado that's happening this fall in front of the Air Quality Control Commission. And I guess I'd like to ask you, would you commit to that same standard that the governor is talking about of zero tolerance for methane emissions?
I don't think there is a scenario where we can have zero emissions. Because if you think about in your lifestyle, in your car, in your electricity that you run in your house, there's always going to have to be a certain quantity of emissions. Now, if you're talking about a commitment to addressing fugitive emissions, a commitment to continuing to develop technology that reduces them, those are all things that we've been committed to and we continue to improve upon. But I don't see a scenario where that's realistic, and it's an area that we strongly disagree with Governor Hickenlooper. That's one of the things that sounds good in a soundbite, but the reality of regulating anything from your house to your car to the oil and gas industry is extraordinarily complex. And making sure that we have good, cost-effective emissions is something that I think we're going to be navigating through the course of this rulemaking and probably for many years to come.
Okay, well, being committed to the idea of reducing emissions and actually doing it are two separate things. And I guess that's one thing that's very important to citizens and community around the state is if natural gas is going to claim to be a cleaner fuel, it has to be cleaner. And right now, it's not. So hopefully that will be addressed in a very specific way in the rulemaking coming up, and that would be great if it is.
I actually think that the way that you distinguish between the two brings up another important point, and that is that if you actually want to address environmental problems, whether the oil and gas industry or greenhouse gas emissions, there's sound bites like oil and gas is not a clean fuel or natural gas is not a clean fuel. And then there's the reality of the complexity on the ground. And if we're actually going to solve these environmental problems, we can't come up with simple sound bites like zero tolerance for methane emissions. We have to dig in and say, Energy is a building block of our community. Its cost is really important to our most vulnerable citizens. These are complex technical problems. How are we going to do this well? And one simple soundbite actually takes us away from the important work of getting to work on these things. So if you're calling for zero emissions in a rulemaking, you're not going to be at the table where the hard work is getting done to significantly reduce emissions. And I hope we can change the nature of the dialogue in that way.
Well, for once, I am going to stand with the governor on this. And so if zero tolerance for emissions means you're not at the table, then I guess he isn't either. But I think that is a very important goal that we should shoot for because our climate requires it. We're seeing so many impacts right now. We've already seen fires in Colorado in January. Last year, we saw the Colorado Springs fire set new records in terms of homes lost and damages. And then this year, we set a new record. 2 days ago, 19 firefighters lost their lives. And these more intense, longer fire seasons are just one of the many impacts that we are facing as a state, as a nation, as a planet from burning fossil fuels. We have got to get this right, and we've got to get it now. And the thing that gets to me is we have the technology now to do it. It's a matter of making it happen.
I couldn't agree with you more on the priority of addressing climate change. I couldn't disagree with you more on your approach, because addressing climate change in a meaningful way means getting away from these easy-sounding answers that rally the crowds and make them cheer, and it actually means getting to work understanding that the technology does not exist for zero methane emissions. Spend some time at the table with the oil and gas industry. It does not exist. Spend some time thinking about the replacement of oil as a fossil fuel. That doesn't exist. But we have some opportunities for great news. The United States has reduced their CO2 to 1992 levels thanks to, in part, the conversion of coal to natural gas. Realistic approaches to things that are going to have immediate results requires a kind of engagement and a kind of compromise that these sort of sound bites.
These are, and I'm about to say, these aren't sound bites. These are, if you go to a local hearing, if you go to Lafayette or Erie or Fort Collins or Longmont, people are wrestling with these issues in a really very day-to-day real way. These aren't sound bites. These are people who want better energy choices. We don't want to have to choose between heating our homes and our kids' health, or heating our homes and contributing to more climate change, right? We want, and that's why Boulder, for example, is investing in how do we get to that clean energy future and how do we do that faster. So that's a dialogue we're having. We may take over our electric utility in the fall so that we can get there faster. And that's what we want to invest in. That's the future we want to be a part of. And that's what we want to do. And in the meantime, we want to make sure that fossil fuel development is done as cleanly as possible so that we don't further hinder our progress towards a clean energy future.
This is great to hear the two of you talk back and forth. Let me ask about the rules that the Bureau of Land Management is trying to establish, and I think the comment period has just been extended. What are you expecting in terms of federal rules on fracking?
I'm going to let Tisha handle that because I'm focused on the local level a little bit more.
So the BLM is looking at rules for federal lands. These aren't national rules that will be relevant on private lands. And that's going to be a dialogue, I think, that continues. Colorado leadership and people from Colorado have been active in making sure that rules that happen on federal lands are relevant, address the most important concerns, address community concerns. And so this is an engagement that will continue for some amount of time. And I don't think it's going to change our expectations about the way the oil and gas industry is regulated. In a lot of ways, I think the things that Suzanne is talking about around air emissions and methane, these are really where the conversation among leaders is going around the importance of regulating the oil and gas industry.
And another important aspect, and this goes back to my Wilderness Society days, is not only the impacts of where you've decided to allow drilling, but where you allow drilling. And in particular on our federal lands, there's a lot of places that are too special to drill. Proposed wilderness area, prime wildlife habitat, key watersheds. And that's one of the things that is really important. And the same sort of thing is true at the local level. We would argue, for example, that we shouldn't have oil and gas drilling in residential neighborhoods. Same kind of things. Like there are siting issues that local governments should have say over that just make common sense. And I guess that's one of the questions I wanted to bridge to, again, to you, Tisha, is don't you agree that where we do oil and gas drilling makes a whole lot of, is an important issue, and that separating this heavy-duty industrial use from things like residential neighborhoods just makes good sense.
I think there's nothing more important than the dialogue that happens at the community level about how they want to produce their energy. I think the context of that conversation is really important. There are communities across Colorado that embrace oil and gas drilling, and there are communities that are unfamiliar with it, and there are communities that outright don't want drilling near them. The nature of the conversation is really important, and I think it cannot be divorced from the fact that our lives are totally interdependent on this resource. And so while I say yes, it is extraordinarily important that if we can figure out a way, no oil and gas company wants to drill in a residential area, but there are private property issues, and there are actually communities that embrace drilling. And so those are conversations that we have to have, and they are difficult, and they will be difficult. I think what's more important is that communities that don't want drilling, but are, just like the rest of us, using oil and gas resources every day in every way, we need to have the conversation about who's supposed to produce your oil and gas for you. I do think it's important that we not be so dismissive of something that is so fundamental and critical to everything that we do. And I think that kind of ownership, I use this, I'm a part of the, if you think it's a problem, the problem, how am I going to be a part of the solution, is different than we don't want this here.
Well, I actually think the conversation needs to be where we as a community, as a state, as a nation, get our energy. And this is what I'm talking about, is people want better options. Yeah, we have to use natural gas now. Would we rather not? Yes. How can we get there? And allowing it into our residential neighborhoods, wells that could be there for decades and decades, I don't think is part of the solution to a sustainable energy future.
That's where we have to leave it for now. Thank you both so much for a very informative discussion here. That is Colorado State of Mind for this weekend. You may see it again or any of our programs at video.rmpbs.org. We will be here again next week with a new edition, and thank you for tuning in this evening. I'm Cynthia Hessen. Good night.
The goal of getting off foreign oil, I agree with 100%. I'm guessing Tisha does too. Whether or not we need to be on oil and for how long, is a question that we need to have as a community. The sun shines for free. The wind blows for free. We need to get ahead of the competitive curve, and right now we're not, in terms of harnessing those free renewable energies and making them work for us.